Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Unnext News Radio podcast, your news source for all things unexplained. And now, here's your host for the Unnext News podcast, Margie K.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Unnext News. I'm your host, Margie K., and we are here every Friday evening. You can watch the show on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, Unnext Network, and just take a look at that. And then be sure to subscribe and like the channel so that you'll get notices of new shows. We also have some new shows coming up here on the network, so watch for that. I have a special guest this evening, and I am really excited to have him on because I saw this this show a few years ago with Scott Walter. You remember America's Unearthed? Well, he talked about this place, and that really sparked my interest. So I'm really happy to have Dennis Stone with me this evening. He's the president of America's Stonehenge. He graduated from Daniel Webster College in 1977 with a degree in aviation management and was a full-time commercial pilot for over 35 years before his retirement in 2016. America's Stonehenge was opened to the public in 1958 by Dennis's father, Robert Stone. Dennis has been involved with America's Stonehenge for most of his life and has always had a fascination with archaeology and archaeoastronomy. Since retiring, Dennis has found many serpentine walls and spirit windows throughout the site, among other new discoveries. He's taken numerous courses and traveled extensively to ancient sites, both in the U.S. and internationally. Welcome to the program, Dennis.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on tonight.
Well, it's good to see you, and I am I've got a million questions for you, and I hope that we have time to get to all of them this evening. I wondered, you said that it was started by your father. Did your father purchase the property knowing this was here, or was it discovered?
Yeah, he knew about this site, and he got involved with it back in 1955, actually. My dad was in the Coast Guard in the early 1950s, and he was up near where they found Lonzo Meadow in Canada, the Viking site, back in 1960. But he was there about 10 years prior to that. He always had a fascination with history, Native Americans, and early colonial history. And when he got out of the Coast Guard, he went to work as an engineer at AT&T Bell Laboratories. And on a Friday night back in 1955, just listening to the radio, it was a Boston station, one of the biggest stations in New England, and he used to hear it up in Labrador and keep touch with what was going on back home, kind of. But on a Friday night, the show was called Yankee Yarns, and the talk show host was Alton Hall Blackington. He was from Maine originally, and I guess he would travel to Boston and do his broadcast from there. It was syndicated all over the Northeast. And they were talking about our site, and my dad only lived 7 miles from this place we call America's Stonehenge, and never had heard about the place. So they're talking about the site, and all of a sudden, they give a location, and it just basically blew him away that this ancient site could be so close, and yet he had never heard of it growing up in all the years that he was there. A few days later at a barber shop, he's looking at a magazine, waiting to have his hair done. And as he's flipping through the magazine, he sees this article, and the article is all about the same place he heard on the radio, but it had photographs too. So he said to the barber, who was busy with another customer, "Hey, can I keep this?" And he goes, "Well, how old is that magazine?" He goes, "Well, it's 1952. It's been sitting here for about 3 years, He goes, "Go ahead and take it." That weekend at my aunt and uncle's house, my mom's sister and her brother-in-law, about 10 people playing cards on a Saturday evening. And my dad passed that magazine around. The magazine was called New Hampshire Profiles. And nobody knew what this place was about as they're looking through it. Nobody recognized it until it got to my aunt and uncle. Again, my mom's sister and her brother-in-law. And they said, "Well, this place is a place we visited back in the 1930s. We used to pedal our bikes about 8 miles from the next town called Derry, New Hampshire." That's where Alan Shepard was from, and Robert Frost also was there too. So they pedaled down from there to this place we call America's Stonehenge today. It was kind of a unofficial and somewhat locally known place to go, with all these stone ruins and everything, and kids like to play up there, but people picnicked up there too. and basically trespassing. And they went up there and they picked it. So my dad's next question at, that evening with all these people around is, can you find the place? And back in 1955, it was not open to the public. There was research going on by a group called the Early Sites Foundation, which was formed in 1954. And it finally, it ran till 1964. And they were a research group. So that was going on at the site at the time. So that Sunday morning, the four of them, my mom, dad, my aunt, and uncle, they left me behind. I was about 18 months old at the time, and my first cousin, he's just a little bit older than I am, with our grandparents, I guess. They drove all around North Salem, New Hampshire, trying to find this place. And there were no road signs. It wasn't open to the public. There's no visitor center like we have today. And eventually they found a road that looked familiar. And again, it was over 20 years since they were there. And they took a chance. They walked up this old dirt road. And when they got on top of the hill, there it was. There was a site that they had been at, back in the 1930s. So my dad actually climbed underneath a chain link fence, which is still there today. The fence goes around what we call the main site. It's about 1 acre. But over time, I'll mention that the site today is about 110 acres, and the ruins cover the entire hilltop. But most of the big structures are located in that 1 acre area. And the fence was put up by the first researcher, William Goodwin from Hartford, Connecticut, in 1937. He put the fence up to protect the site from vandalism. Mm-hmm. He put a chain, barbed wire chain on top of it. He put it backwards, so it was kind of aiming in. And I guess the idea was to keep people from stealing artifacts from the site. So it was locked up. My dad climbed underneath of it through a hole where other people had snuck. The rest of them stayed outside waiting for quite a while. When he finally came back out, he was pretty, again, blown away by the whole site, and basically mentioned that he would love to get involved with the research, the study of the site, maybe even open it up to the public as a museum someday. Because my mom said, you have rocks in your head, And he's got a new family. They actually built the house. They actually built the house pretty much, they did it themselves pretty much. And then they had myself and my sister was on her way at that time. So I'm sure my mom's last thought was to open up a stone ruins to the public, But over the next 3 years until 1958, my dad met the owner of the site. His name was Malcolm Pearson. And he worked out an arrangement for the next several years to 1965 to lease the site. And he opened it up in 1958, basically coincidentally on the summer solstice. So this summer, we'll have a 65th year being open to the public. Wow. It's kind of hard to believe that much time has gone by. But my dad retired after 30 years from AT&T about a little bit less than 40 years ago, when he died in 2009. And he spent his last years kind of doing research and study on the site. And in 2003, they put out a new book on the site, and we're just about to put out a new book. I'm writing it with my daughter-in-law, and hopefully that'll be out this summer. It got delayed by COVID, and my daughter-in-law had our first grandchild back a little over 2 years ago, and everything kind of got slowed down because of that. So we're probably going to finish it up this summer, and we'll have a new textbook out and mention some of the new things that we found since 20 years ago.
Well, that's
so my dad,
interesting.
So my dad actually bought the site in 65, after leasing it, but it was intentional, It wasn't like he bought the property and found this on it. The site had been written up in 1907 by Edgar Gilbert, who was a friend of Robert Frost, actually, in the history of Salem. And we have a couple copies, a very, very thick book, and it talks about the place and how it was a wild and wonderful place among the soft pines and rough boulders where weird tales may be woven. And again, that's from 1907 by Edgar Gilbert. And kind of poetic, and kind of describes the site because that's sort of what you see when you go up there,
Do you know when it was first discovered?
Yeah, that's kind of a good question. We know when it was first recognized, I suppose. Probably, we know the Patty family were there. The Pattys were basically several generations of shoemakers that came over from England around 1675 to Virginia. And then a gentleman named Peter came up to Massachusetts into the Salem area. And he left his wife and his son behind, and then he sent for him, and they never showed up. And then he married another woman. And eventually his original son showed up in Massachusetts, much to everybody's surprise, because the oldest son would inherit all the goods, So he had children from the other wife too, the second wife. And it wasn't like he abandoned her. It's like he sent for her, and he must have thought she passed away because he had all the letters and everything. And the town was a little unhappy, thinking he abandoned his wife. So they were shoemakers. And by 1734, one of the Patty it was Peter, then Richard, then Seth. And Seth, the grandson of Peter, actually bought the first piece of property by the hill. And it was part of Haverhill, Massachusetts, called the Haverhill Peak at the time. And then several years later, it becomes part of New Hampshire. They divided New Hampshire and Massachusetts in 1741 in the southeast corner. It was no longer part of Haverhill, Massachusetts, or the Haverhill Peak. It became the Salem district. And in 1744, Seth bought another piece of property, which we think included the site where the ruins are. But they don't really mention that at that time, In 1750, the town of Salem is incorporated. And that's when you start to see homes start to go up in this area on the record, And then there's Seth Jr., who we think actually built a house, and they put it on part of the site, the main site today. And around 1802, he had a son named Jonathan. In 1802, Jonathan actually inherits the site. On Christmas Eve, his mother gave it to him in a quitclaim. And in 1803, he moves his family in there. So we have kind of a history of people as well as use of the property. But the first real probably recording of it is at 1907, where Edgar Gilbert really describes it. Mm-hmm. But the Patty family knew it was there. They caused damage to the site. Jonathan, again, was a shoemaker. He dies in 1849. But before he died, he was a tax collector for 3 years, besides being a shoemaker, a cordwainer. He did some road survey work. He kept busy, because he had to make money, and he did it in different ways. And in 1831, he actually he puts a bid in for the town poor people. They call them the town paupers. And several people in town did that and have the original written document, all handwritten, with people who would put bids in to care for people that could no longer care for themselves in the town of Salem. And he did that from 1831 to 1837. He took in the town paupers. 1838, he's no longer doing that. And that's when we believe he got involved with the Underground Railway, helping slaves escape to Canada. And Wilbur Seibert writes about the Underground of, I believe, Ohio, New York, and in Massachusetts. He mentions our site several times. And he mentions a Mr. Poor, a Mr. Donald, and a Mr. Hussey from about 20 miles south of here in Massachusetts, a place called Shawsheen Village. And in the middle of the night, one of them, like Mr. Donald, Hussey, or Poor, would take a horse named Nellie, and they would come all the way up here with one of the slaves, bring him to our site, and then he'd be returned to home for breakfast by morning. So the site becomes part of the Underground Railway network, and that's under Jonathan Patty. And he dies in 1849, and then in 1855, his wife, his house got partly burnt, and then his wife moves away from the property, from what we understand. So they actually had quarrymen on the site, removing part of the site. We estimate between 25 to maybe 50% of the site is now missing, unfortunately. So instead of building the site, they're actually removing it. And that's true of a lot of sites. Even in, Giza Plateau, you look at the pyramids, they strip them of the outside limestone, to build other structures.
Yeah, they just didn't know what they had.
Yeah, that happens. It wasn't anything they didn't mean, but it was damaging to the site, obviously. And we have about 16 drill marks where they used the plug and feather to split the large slabs so they could move them. They had to. Some of these stones weighed 14 tons, 10 tons. And what they did is they busted them in half using that plug and feather. They drilled holes and they put a tapered guide with a plug and they strike it with a sledgehammer. And that technique started in the late 1700s. And I think we only have 16 of those holes on the site. So if the Patty family had built it, I think the whole every chamber, the big roof slabs, you'd see this type of technology used to actually shape the stones, if they had built the site. You'd find hundreds of these, plug and feather marks. But there's only about 16 of them left, and these guys were hauling the stones away, building local projects, unfortunately. And that was during the Patty era. And Patty's grandson, George, got a hold of the property. He sold it to a lumberman named Nathaniel H. Paul, and he went up there and started taking trees out and bringing them down about half a mile down the street to a place called Cowbell Corner. He had a sawmill with a cowbell on it, and we have photographs of that. It's been long gone. It's been gone since the late 1800s, I think, but there's pictures from the 1800s of the sawmill still there. So he was actually using the hilltop for a woodlot to take trees out of there. Then it goes back to the Patty family, and then it goes out to a guy named Fred Dustin, and he's the guy that the first researcher bought the property in 1937 and put up the chain link fence. So there's kind of a long record of land use and ownership, and your question's very good. Some of these trace back some earlier possible message or are mentioning, I should say, of the site, but it's so vague, it's kind of hard to tell if they're talking about our site or not. So I'd say 1907 is the first real good one by Edgar Gilbert, probably.
How did you get involved in the site?
I had no choice. My dad. Yeah, I mean, I was 18 months old when I first, when they first got involved with it. And it's been my whole life, basically. I went into the airlines for a career. Like I say, my dad was at AT&T, Bell Laboratories as a career. And my wife, she had a career at Chrysler Financial. And she also was worked for another company called Waddell & Reed, and a financial company. And I met her back in 1984. And about 10 years later, she left the corporate world and began running the museum. And my son was a baby at the time, and he was actually, about 3 years old when she left the corporate world, and she decided to just have him there and homeschool him too,
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of grew up with the place too. So I have one son, and so he's a third generation, and now we have a 2-year and maybe 3-month old granddaughter, and she's there 4 days a week working. And yeah, so her mom works for us too.
Multi-generational.
Yeah, she's a sweetheart. She loves it over there. We have alpacas and everything, and she has her own little place upstairs with her mom. Her mom met my son in college, and she pretty much joined us right out of graduation. She's been with us for about 14 years, and then we had our granddaughter. And the day we had our granddaughter, we had a big thing going on our site. It was a new type of testing to us called optically stimulated luminescence. And that was on 9/11/2020. And my daughter-in-law headed to the hospital for an emergency, I guess, C-section. And we were all, nervous as anything about that. In the meantime, we had this big group coming of about 20, almost 24 people, to do optically stimulated luminescence to take the cores on our hilltop. And it was all planned out on that, The emergency C-section wasn't planned.
Right.
But we had Dr. Feathers from the University of Washington. We had 2 physicists from Brookhaven National Laboratory. We had this 2 state archaeologists from the state capital in Concord. We had our own archaeologist who was a president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society. She knows all these people, And we had a ground penetration radar woman with us, and her friend who had the LIDAR. And then we had a geophysicist, and we had a group called, my dad's group that he started in 1964. We had the OSL team from this group called the New England Antiquities Research Association. When the Early Sites Foundation finally dissolved, a number of their members died in the early 60s. My dad started this group to replace it called NERA, or the New England Antiquities Research Association. So they were kind of the ones running the OSL testing. And it was a mess that day. I mean, we had 20-something people. We're doing cores all over the hilltop, and I'm waiting to hear how, my daughter-in-law is doing and how the baby was doing. So it will be a day I'll never forget. So it was quite an exciting day for us. I think my blood pressure went up a little that day.
I'll bet. And
yeah.
Why don't we show a few of the pictures, and I'll let you explain what these are.
I've never seen that before. No. So that's one of our serpentine walls. And since 2016, when I found my first one, that wasn't it there. That might have been my third one I found. I retired and I started spending more time out in the woods. And my first one I found was about 27 feet long. It was linear. It was straight. It tapered down to a flat tail and had like a block head. And I got off my ATV. I was riding to the northwest of the property out towards where my dad used to live. On that very wood trail. And I said, the sunlight hit it just a certain way. I get off, I walked about, 60, 70 feet to it, and I get over to it. I said, oh my God, I think I'm looking at a wall that looks like a snake. But I had no frame of reference. And over the next couple months, this is one of the walls that I noticed looked like a snake. And we've been looking at that wall since we opened that trail up in 1974. It's part of an astronomical alignment trail to the west of the main site, about 600 feet from where the main site is. And you can see it starts with a head on the right side. It's a boulder. It's kind of, yeah, and then it goes to the left, and it goes to the right, and then it goes way off in the distance to the left again. It about 140 feet in length, and it runs basically north and south, and it's an S-shaped serpent. Since then, we found at least 4 different types. There's a linear one, or straight one, and there's one with a 90-degree head or tail we call it rectilinear, and then we have this S-shaped, a curvilinear one, And then we have ones that loop around and they look like they could be biting the tail, a thing called the Ouroboros. We have all of those at our site. So that thing sits on bedrock, and we've been looking at it, like I mentioned, since 1974, but it didn't quite look like that. There was so much tree and brush there that you could see sections of it, but you couldn't really see the whole thing as you can see that today. We've done a forest management program. It took two winters to do it with heavy equipment. They removed the trees, they thinned everything out and opened all the alignments. And now you can see what this thing looks like. It looks like a snake.
It sure does. It reminds me of the Serpent Mound.
Exactly. And that's something that's fascinating to us too, the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. In fact, I was on a radio show like we're doing right now, and the first hour was with Jeff Wilson. He's from the Serpent Mound in Ohio, and he was speaking. And when he finished, they asked him to stay on the line to actually ask me a few questions about my serpent walls. It turns out that he's been to our site. So it was a nice chat. He had been there many years ago before we knew about serpent walls. So I was quite fascinated by our serpent walls. So what you're looking at there is something I found in 2016 also. I found what we believe are windows. These are windows in the walls. You can see the holes there. And this one's a double window. And we didn't know anything about those. My dad died in 2009. He didn't know anything about the serpent walls, although he looked at the walls over all the time. He was out there looking at the walls before he passed away. And I'd be on the road, on an overnight in a hotel, and he'd say, these walls are just as important as the main site. They're all over the hill. They're very strange. They turn, they twist, they bend. Farmers' walls are fairly linear with some exceptions, and they're made out of a lot of rounded field stones. These have flat slabs, and there you can see some of the flat slabs that make up these two windows. Mm-hmm. These are 2 of the 14, and they generally are associated with the serpent walls at our site. But in this case, I think that wall might not be a serpent wall unless it is. It doesn't look like one to me, That's another window. That's kind of cool. We've been looking at that since 1970, that wall. It's actually an arched wall. It runs maybe about 50 or 60 feet. The other end of it is where you stand to watch the winter solstice sunset alignment. And when I showed this to 2016 to late Dr. Stuart Smith, he was with us for almost 40 years. And before he came to us in 78, he was in England working for what today is called English Heritage. I think it was called the Ancient Site Administration or something like that in England, and in Scotland too. So I showed it to him before he passed away, and he walked over to it, looked at the moss, the lichen on it, and he said, yep. He goes, how the heck did we ever miss this? I said, I don't know. There was more brush around it, but it's a beautiful, we believe, linteled window. So that's one of 14 of those. Wow. That you're looking at is LiDAR, and it's a handheld LiDAR I mentioned earlier. The gentleman's name is Tom Elmore. He's from Connecticut. And 3 years ago, he called me on the phone and said, I'd like to come up and do some LiDAR on your site. And since then, he's done sites all over. He's from Connecticut again. Connecticut's loaded with these sites, and they go, again, right down towards Virginia. So he's been doing LiDAR on some of the sites from here all the way down there. He's a landscape architect with a master's degree, and he got into LiDAR about 3 years ago. This is a $50,000 handheld LiDAR. You can see down to 1 centimeter. It puts out like 300,000 points per second. And each square meter puts out 150,000 points. And he explained that the drone LiDAR 3 years ago only puts out between 400 and 800 points, and airborne was 4 to 8 points. We got, U.S. government finished a LiDAR program across the United States in 2018, from what I understand. And we got LiDAR from 10 years ago, and it was nice to get it. It was all blown up by one of the researchers for us. But when you look at the walls that cover the site, they're all blurry. You can't make out any detail. But with this handheld LiDAR, you can see down to 1 centimeter with it. It's very, very high resolution. What you were looking at there, we think, is the biggest serpent wall in construction, possibly not only at our site, but bigger than any that we know. That boulder, we believe, is a head looking at you with the pointed tail right in front of it. And it goes 2,550 feet around counterclockwise, touches every astronomical stone that you look at. We call it a foresight. To have an alignment, you have to have a back sight and foresight, kind of like a gun sight. You look at the first one, and you look at the second one, then you look at the sun, moon, or stars, whatever you're looking at. And the stones you're looking at in the distance, they're part of that serpent. And it comes around, and it comes right back in front of its, what would be the mouth, and then it has a 90-degree pointed tail. So that's 2,550 feet. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio is a mound built on, I think, a stone foundation. and that's 1,350 feet. So this might be almost twice as
Wow.
long as that. But that's a mound. That would be like still the biggest mound, and ours is a stone wall. But
That's
as far as serpents goes, we could have one of the biggest, possibly.
okay. Well, we are going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll hear more, and I can already tell I'm going to need to have you come back a second time, Dennis. We'll be right
Thank
back.
you.
Are you thinking about purchasing a wood-fired heating or cooking appliance but don't know where to start? The new book, Wood-Fired Heating and Cooking, will guide you through the process and make the decision much easier. Find out about wood stoves, wood-burning fireplace inserts, masonry heaters, cook stoves, brick ovens, and more. Learn about operation and maintenance, buying and storing wood, even how to make your own charcoal. A bonus section includes delicious recipes for cooking in a wood-burning oven, grill, tandoori oven, or smoker. The wise homeowner, prepper, or homesteader will have the ability to heat their home with wood when the power goes out or to save money on increasing gas bills. Wood-fired heating and cooking is available at Amazon. Visit www.woodfiredpub.com for more information. That's woodfiredpub.com. If you've ever wanted to learn how to remote view, take the remote viewing workshop. Learn how to view energy fields and even inside the human body and on a microscopic level as well. View past scenes or events or locations anywhere, even faraway places. We all have the same exact physiology, so we can all remote view. Visit unxnetwork.com for more information. We are back with the show. This is Margie K with UNX News, and talking this evening with Dennis Stone. He's the president of America's Stonehenge in southeastern New Hampshire. And this is a fascinating spot and a fascinating tale. So let us continue with that. Let me find the other pictures here. Here we go. Tell us what this is. Was this LiDAR?
That is LiDAR again, yeah. And actually, that's a kind of a profile from the right side of what we were looking at in the previous LiDAR picture or image. On the very, very left of that, you can see a hump. It's very small in the picture, of course, but that's the hump before the 90-degree bend in the tail. And we always knew that hump was there, but we never recognized why they may have designed the wall like that. The next thing you look at is the boulder itself, which on the other side of it is what we call the watch house chamber. Behind that, you can see the wall continues to the right and it starts undulating up and down. And we never really noticed that until we got the brush out of there just several years ago, since 2016. And today, when you walk up to the chamber from maybe even a couple hundred feet away, you can see what you're looking at there. And it's pretty impressive to see that, And again, it goes to the right, 2,550 feet counterclockwise, goes back in front of its face, and then ends with a pointed tail. So that's part of that same, large serpent, which might be the Ouroboros, as I mentioned earlier.
Wow. This is impressive.
That's you can see the monoliths standing there. And on either side, on the inside between them is what we call the groove table, or it's been referred to also as the sacrificial table. And it runs east and west, and it's about a 4.5-ton slab, about 9,000 pounds, and it sits on 4 stone legs. And when the first researcher came, Mr. Goodwin, back in 1936 to first visit the site and photograph it, the table was there, but the soil had accumulated all the way up to the base of it, and it appeared to be just sitting on the ground. And when they got to site in 1937, put up the chain link fence, and he hired a crew, They began cleaning out the debris and the brush, and then they began excavating, and they found the table was sitting up on 4 stone legs. And to the left of the table, you see kind of a mound with some stones, part of a wall, kind of a grassy area. That's actually a chamber. It's kind of concealed under that grass there. It's the biggest chamber still on the property. It's called the Oracle Chamber. And the Oracle Chamber actually runs north and south, east and west. It has 5 closets, 2 underground storm drains made by these ancient people, one of them running 45 feet, keeps the structure dry. And then the other one, we haven't located the exit of the drain yet. It probably goes in, a dozen feet or so. But we have a whole network of these drains that were built before the site was built. Some of them run 75 feet. And what they did is they channeled the bedrock. They actually quarried out the bedrock in like long grooves in the water, maybe 3 or 4 inches wide, maybe an inch deep. And the water will fall this kind of a man-made channel in the bedrock, and it goes into an underground drain, and then the water continues in the drain and then exits out the hill. So there's about a dozen of those. But that Oracle Chamber has a lot of interesting features, including a large stone seat. It has an 8-foot bed. It has 2 carvings, one of it, what they call the deer carving, and another one is kind of an arrow carving near the exit of it. It had a window, it had a chimney flue, and it had 2 stone louvers that would be used to adjust the draft. And I believe it was the second year we were open, somebody took them away for souvenirs, we guess. We still have the photographs of them, but It's a shame that somebody actually stole them. I mean, they're kind of priceless.
Oh, and God.
Yeah, that happened almost immediately when we opened, So vandalism has gone at our site as well as, of course, other sites too. And it's very sad when people do that.
Oh, that is sad.
But we have a photographic record of them, though. But that chamber is just simply amazing, Yeah, that's looking kind of north. And that chamber there runs east and west. The chamber we were talking about, the Oracle Chamber, you can't see it, but it's off to the right side of that in the distance. This chamber reminds me of some of the chambers I've seen in Western Europe. In France, when we went there in Karnak, all the rows of stone, but there are chambers there too. One of them looks like what we call the chamber in ruins, kind of a shoebox shaped chamber. And then this chamber here actually reminds me of what they call a galley or gallery chamber. They always run east and west. They run 20 to 60 feet in length. They were used as tombs, it's believed, and they're found in northwest Ireland. I've been to Ireland, but I didn't get to that part of Ireland. They're found in France, which I saw a couple of these in France, but they're also in Holland, and they call them the Giant's Bed, or Hidden Boden, I think it's called. It's a Dutch word. And I've had people that actually have visited these, and they said, yeah, they always run east and west, and they were used as burials. So those stones that are on the walls, those vertical slabs, are called orthostats. And they're big slabs that are stood on their end, and then on top of that, they place those big slabs which form the roof. Orthostats can be in a structure like that, and they're in a couple of our structures, but they can be in the stone walls too. And farmers, when they built walls in New England, about 240,000 miles of walls, they used mostly rounded field stones to build their walls. The walls are going to be fairly straight, linear, and they're field clearings, stock fences, and boundaries. Mm-hmm. But in our walls on a hilltop, they turn, they twist, they bend. Some are serpentine walls, and some have slabs of stone stood up just in the walls, like you see, without a roof on it, of course. And again, they're called orthostats. And they're found in Western European sites too.
Do you have any idea how old this site is?
Well, the carbon datings we've done since 1966 to 1995, there were 12 of them. One did not test because it wasn't enough mass. 2 different laboratories did the dating for us. One was Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts, and the other one was Geochrome Laboratories, also located in Massachusetts and Cambridge, Mass. I think that laboratory's moved to Lowell, New Hampshire, Lowell, Massachusetts now. The oldest date of the main site was from 1971, and that date was 4,000 years old. There was a 1969 date in the same area from 3,000 years ago, and there was another 3,000-year-old date from another part of the hilltop too. Another part of the site, and that was from 1970. We did the survey of the alignment starting in 1973. We hired a survey team called Beverly Pearson and Associates of Derry, New Hampshire. We hired them to come down and start surveying our astronomical alignments. By 1977, they collected the data, what we call phase 1, sent it to the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in 78, we got the results back, and they said, we have the name of the person that did the analysis, the report, and everything. They said if these are used for astronomical purposes, they would work about 1800 BC, plus or minus about 200 years, due to the Earth's tilt. It changes very slowly.
Yes.
And it's a cycle of about 41,000 years. It's called the obligity cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And that agreed with a 1971 4,000-year-old date, because actually the date came back was something like about corrected. It was 1800 BC plus or minus about 250 years. So carbon dating, astronomical data seem to agree with one another. So we think about 4,000 years ago is when the construction went on. And it might have gone on over generations, so it might have not been completed at once. It might have been many, many centuries later that they did more work on the site. So,
and that's the time period when a lot of these monolithic sites were being built around the world. Do you have any thoughts on who the people were that built this?
There's been different theories of who could have built this. First off, we know in New Hampshire, this is a surprise too. Native Americans have been in New Hampshire in a place called Keene. It's in the western part of the state, I think is the latest finds, 13,000 years ago. And the reason it's surprising is because the glacial period, around 15,000 years ago, it started warming up, and then we had the Younger Dryas, and it cooled everything off again. So to have somebody here 13,000 years ago, no matter who they were, it would have been pretty harsh conditions, So the thing is, people come into our site, go, who was here 4,000 years ago? But before that, in northern New Hampshire, above the White Mountains, not too far from the Canadian border, they found a number of years ago evidence between 10 and 12,000-year-old, human existence there. So again, that was another surprise. So people were here, but because of the style of construction, inscriptions, and even a thing called the standard unit of measure at our site, as well as some of the other sites they've been finding, we think there's a old world, possibly European, Mediterranean, or African influence into these sites. I see a lot of similarities between some of the structures like the east-west chamber, the V-hut, the chamber in ruins, the south-facing chamber, and a few of the other structures. But if we go outside our site, there's over 800 of these sites from Quebec, Canada, east of Montreal, Ontario, Canada, including in Ontario, there's structures and dolmens, but there's also the serpentine wall up there too in Ontario. But all the way down towards Virginia, but all the way west, we're finding serpentine walls all the way out to California in a town called Weed, right near Mount Shasta. And that was brought to my attention, I'd say about 3 or 4 years ago. I got 110 pictures from one of the vice presidents in the era. He's retired now from that, but he's still very active in research. And he sent me these photographs, and I was blown away. Almost 3,000 miles away, they got the same kind of serpentine patterns out there. We know they're in Colorado. Alabama, they call them rattlesnake walls. And Dr. Holstein from Jacksonville State University has invited us out and to go with him from the university. He'll take us out to this area that's 40 square miles. It has cairns, which we have in New England, to the big piles of rocks with standing stones or monoliths. It also has serpentine walls. And he's been working on those since the 1970s. We didn't know that. Now he knows that the Northeast has them, and he knows something about our site. And now we know that he has, serpentine walls too. His tend to be a little bit smaller on the average than what we have in the Northeast. Some of ours can go, a few hundred feet, whereas his probably go a few dozen feet, perhaps, from what I can, a little bit smaller ones, but the same idea, stone walls that look like a snake. Some people suggest that even the great Serpent Mound in Ohio was inspired by Draco, the constellation. And 4,000 years ago, and before that, for a few centuries, was the pole star was Thuban, or Alpha Draconis, which is part of Draco. And Draco kind of looks like a serpent or maybe a dragon. So in the evening, people would be looking at the pole star. We have a true north alignment with that. One of the monoliths aligns with that. They could have been there at night watching it turn, with the earth spinning. They'd see Draco moving around its star. And the Egyptians looked at Draco too, and that's one of the shafts in the Great Pyramid, the North Star. Today it's Polaris, of course. For the last several centuries, it's been the pole star. But because the precession of the equinox is a 25,920-year cycle. So these sites are all over North America. It's just amazing. And that is the watch house again, and that's the chamber, the watch house chamber. I'm standing there on equinox, sunrise, and I'm looking into it. And the boulders on the right side of it, you can't see the pointed tail. It's out of the picture. But you're looking into that chamber, you see that white stone in the back wall. It's very, very white. It's quartzite, a very, very light colored stone. And on the equinox, the sunlight illuminates that. I think the next picture I sent you might have a close-up of that so the audience can see it a little bit better. The interesting thing is, that's actually 30 minutes after it's fully illuminated. That one there is kind of cool too, because it looks like the stone is actually framed on the left side and the top. I think there's another picture there somewhere. And then 30 minutes later, that's actually a different chamber that we call the south-facing chamber. I hope I did not send you the fully illuminated.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. Hopefully it's here.
Yeah, it's really cool. And a friend from Texas actually predicted in 2019 that if we cleared out the trees, which we did the next year, we had that forest management thing for 2 years, and we made sure they cleared out the trees to our neighbor's boundary, and it allowed the sunlight to go in. And there it is right there. The sunlight, a year later, after she predicted it using Sunseeker app on her phone, and she got in the back of the chamber, because that's been talked about since for many years. And Hans Holz's book, 1992, called Long Before Columbus, was all about our site. And Hans, they had a TV show on him on Travel Channel for 2 years recently. We were part of that, and they brought in Scott Walters for that show too. Mm-hmm. But Hans started visiting us in 1970. He's considered by many to be like the father of the paranormal. But anyway, my friend came up from Texas. She had her Sunseeker. She's in the back. She goes, if you come here and you could see the light come in here, it will strike a stone on the equinox sunrise sometime around 9 in the morning. A year later, we had the forest, we had it opened up, and the sunlight came in, and it actually illuminated that stone in the back. And then 30 minutes later, it looks like a hand with an index finger pointing back. The thought of that is this illumination might represent the male, the sun, the rays, the fertilization, the womb, the egg being fertilized. And that morning out in Colorado, there were 2 caves, Pathfinder and Crack Creek Cave. I'd never heard of them until a few years ago. They're caves, but they've been modified. And in the back wall is petroglyphs. And on the equinox, the same morning that we're watching this, probably an hour or 2 later, the sunlight's entering those caves, and it's illuminating a serpent, splitting it in half with a shadow and light effect. At Chaco Canyon, we have the sun dagger, but on the equinox, there's another serpent, and it's split in half by a shadow light effect. And a cave in California called Mojave North does the same thing. In Mexico, Chichen Itza, which I've been to, on that same morning, Kukulkan, the serpent, goes down the 91 staircase. So our illumination. I
was there and saw that. It was quite impressive.
Oh, you see, I've been there, but we weren't there on the right day. That's pretty amazing. You're the first person I've heard
that.
And it was
accidental at that. We were getting ready to leave, and the bus driver stops the bus up on the hill and says, look, this is the equinox, and watch the serpent come down. And, I don't believe in coincidences. I think we were there for a reason.
I wish that happened to us. I think we were there in the summer, so there's no chance we could have, but we were there. But that's awesome that you get to see that. So that same morning, we're watching the sunlight illuminate what we think is an egg, and it actually frames it so beautifully. And it's because of the shape of the entrance, and because the way they did Chichen Itza is amazing. Way Kukulkan can go down those steps, as the sun's rising. I guess it is. It was sunrise or sunset. I'm trying to remember on the Chichen Itza. Was that a morning event?
Sunset is when I saw it.
Okay, yeah, it might, and I think there's something in the morning on that, but our stuff is in the morning and the others are in the morning. But yeah, that one, I was thinking it was, but it's the same day. We had the same thing with the serpent going on, So we have 57 alignments for the sun, moon, and stars that we know of.
57.
Yeah, what happened in 78, not only did they tell us that the alignments would work about 1800 BC plus or minus, but they said you have 24 star alignments. That was kind of a shock to us. And the reason they found that is because all the survey work, they analyzed it, and they found that we had a gentleman from Penn State in 1997, Dr. Winkler. He was a professor of archaeoastronomy from 64. I think he retired in 99. And 2 years before he retired, he would come up. He came to our site for the first time, introduced himself, and we went out to dinner with him. And then he kept coming back quite often. And he met with my dad. I was on the road a lot flying, so I didn't see him all the time. And unfortunately, in 2001, he had a heart attack. So after about a little over 4 years of investigating our site, he wrote a 30-page report that was a work in progress, but he passed away before ever completing it. He was working on those 20 we knew one of the alignments was a star alignment because it's a true north alignment, but the other 23 were a mystery to us. So he was identifying what stars and what era they would align with these stones. So he worked on that, and he pretty much identified them. But again, he never completed that because of his, I think he had a heart attack and he died suddenly. It was kind of a shock to us. But we do need a new archaeoastronomer. Although we've been doing some work on it, we need a professional, really. And it's been 20 years. It would also be, even with the serpentine walls and everything, it might be as above, so below. So they might have been looking at constellations. But I have another wall there. It's called the True North Wall. And we opened up that pathway by it in 1974. My dad wrote the whole report out. I was part of that. And that stone right there, by the way, is the first stone that we watched the sun or anything, any alignment at our hill at all. And that was taken 2 years ago. But the first photographs we have from 1967 of that stone. And that's the winter solstice sunset. And there's another picture just taken back a little bit further where you actually stood to watch it. So you have a back sight, foresight, the point you stood at. You can see how beautiful that is. It looks like an arrowhead. Very, very pretty.
Absolutely.
That's a North Stone. That's the one that aligns with Polaris today and would have aligned with Thuban 4,000 years ago. You can see the kind of arrowhead-shaped stones. And the walls on either side of it, they're not like that stone. They're all just smaller rocks, a couple feet high. But you can see how these stones stand up above that. Very prominent. That's a summer solstice monolith. It looks similar to the winter solstice and the other one. They actually took advantage of the horizon, too. If you look at that very closely, it actually looks even more so when you come in person. The two hills actually intersect in a little V, and they stood the stone up right in that little V there. It makes it beautiful with the sun rolling down the hill on the left, and then it strikes the top of the stone just before sunset on the summer solstice.
Nice.
Well, that one there, I'm looking at this building. That is an aerial off of Google Maps. That's what the hilltop looks like. You can see all the alignments. Those are all tree clearings that we started back in 1965. So it's recently we opened a lot more with the forest management program, opened them up more, further, wider. And we opened up the lunar alignments that had never been opened up before because the next lunar alignment comes up in 2025. It's called the Lunar Major Standstill, North and South Moonrise and Moonset. And so we made sure with our licensed forester that we got those open for this event coming up.
Boy, that sure looks intentional to me. And the amount of work that had to have gone into this, it must have taken them years to construct it.
That's a great point. We have our assistant archaeologist, and he's a stonemason with the University of Boulder for that and another school in New Hampshire. And he's been with us for about 12 years. He was working with our Dr. David Stewart Smith before he passed. He worked with David going back into the 90s because he enjoyed archaeology too. He did that as kind of something to do for enjoyment, And he's actually going out and he's looking at the stone walls and he's coming up with an estimate of each foot of wall, how long it would take to build, to take the stones, to move them, to set them up. And that doesn't include the big slabs that had to be quarried out of the bedrock and then transported. Some of those are pretty heavy across the ground and then stood up. And that takes more work than just a stone you can pick up with your hand. These are several 100-pound stones that had to be quarried out of the ground. And they actually show signs of being shaped using percussion flaking, like you would on a arrowhead. And then they would position them into the wall either as an orthostat, a monolith, or sometimes they're in layers, one on top of the other stacked up horizontally. They call that lace work. So he's going to do an estimate of the thousands and thousands of feet of walls, which we don't believe are colonial or post-colonial. And that's not going to include the work that was done on the site, just to see how much effort it would take. So it wasn't on a whim. Somebody just went up there and built it, like the Patty family, for the heck of it, There must have been a purpose for it, and a dedication to doing that,
Absolutely. Were any bones ever found there?
Yeah, there's been bones found, a couple in the watch house. And the ones in the watch house, one was a bone about a little over an inch long, and it had a drill hole in it. And that was interesting, And right near it, they found a piece of stone. It looked like a piece of slate, triangular shaped, and it had a drill hole. Our thought is they were used as pendants. They were found right inside the watch house. A couple other bones were found in the watch house that they weren't able to identify, but another two were found. And there were three on the main site that were found by Mr. Goodwin back in 1938. In 1968, a woman, school teacher, brought him to the Smithsonian in Washington. And a Dr. Lucy Huygen, a physical anthropologist, examined them back in '68, and the bones that she said she thought were human had scratches on them, and she said these were made while the person was alive. So that brings up a lot of like, why, what happened,
Oh,
But we couldn't carbon date them because Mr. Goodwin took them out of the ground in 1938. Carbon dating didn't start with Dr. Libby till around 1946. Really, 1950, they really got it going. But when you have charcoal or bone or anything organic that you want to carbon date, and even shell, you have to put it in a container like aluminum foil immediately and then ship it off to the laboratory. They sat around for 30 years, and 20 years of that in our museum, So they're not eligible, or they can't be carbon dated. My interest is, can they be DNA? Because her comment about the bones were, I think these are human, but the density is they said, she goes, it's much more dense material than I would normally think for a human bone. So she said the density of the bones were very, very heavy. So that made it kind of interesting too. And I have a friend, L.A. Mazzulli. He does a lot of work. He's done the Paracas skulls in South America. And he uses a laboratory, I believe, near Toronto. I used to fly into Toronto a lot, so I was probably right near it. And he sent a picture of the laboratory. It's something that we're considering. Maybe we can have these 3 human bones looked at for DNA. That would be kind of interesting to see what the results are. And those are the only 3 human bones that were identified. And the other bones were looked at. She said, these are bison. And she showed them to a colleague. And he goes, yes, they're bison. She goes, yeah, but they're found in New Hampshire. He goes, well, in ancient times, the bison or buffalo were in New Hampshire. They were called, I believe, the woodland bison. And so we have bison bones found there too, and they're in the watch house. So I don't know how they get in the watch house, whether there's somebody placed in there. It's still a question, I think the site's ceremonial, so it's possible somebody stuck things in there, for offerings, something like that. It's a possibility, especially the pendants too, So yeah, bones have been found. But one thing about bones in New England, they usually dissolve because of the acidity in the soil. I know our archaeologist, Pat, she's been working on this stuff since the late 70s. She's been an archaeologist. And she was a president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society. Her husband was a doctor of geology at Tufts University. So she goes, yeah, bones usually dissolve in about 200 or 300 years because of the soil conditions. And also animals eat them up, of course. But they do find bones in New Hampshire Archaeological Society's publications. I see some of them going back a few thousand years. So it depends on the soil. Maybe it's in peat or clay or something. They do find them. But generally, bones dissolve in a few hundred years. So, they're not everywhere, So we're lucky to have what we found, I guess.
All right. We've got 2 minutes left. So what kind of research is currently going on there?
Well, I've been doing a lot of research with the LiDAR, with the ground penetration radar. As a matter of fact, they're going to blend the images together. The woman with the radar is going to blend the images from the LiDAR and make 3D above and below. We're going to do more work, of course, with the astronomy. We're interested in the standard unit of measure. When you build something, you use the yardstick. It appears a site, and we've been looking at this since the 70s, may have been the megalithic yard, which is found in megalithic sites in Europe. It's 32 inches, 0.64. And I met the father of archaeoastronomy who found that, Dr. Alexander Tom. We met with him 40 years ago, last fall on Thanksgiving at his house. And he died 2 years later, but he's kind of well known, in megalithic circles, as being the father of archaeoastronomy, along with his son, Dr. Archibald Tom. The megalithic yard is found through Europe, and they're finding it in some of the other sites. We think there's 800 sites today. I might have mentioned that earlier they're starting to look at these, and that LiDAR can see down to a centimeter. So that's a great tool for determining measurements, height, width, depth, that kind of thing. So that's one thing we're working on too.
Well, this has just absolutely been fascinating, and I can't wait to get out there myself. Maybe I can be able to do that this spring, perhaps, and maybe be out there at the equinox.
Oh, that'd be great.
Some equinox would be
great. Any of them would be perfect.
I just love to see it, and I'd like to find out if you've had any psychics come out and observe, or remote viewers. So we'll talk about that sometime.
Yeah, check out Hans Holzer's book or the TV show. I think we're the second season, episode 14. Ancient Evil on the Holzer Files. I think you can probably pull it on Hulu, and it's on Discovery Plus. And it's all about Hans Holzer and his years spent at our site, So, and the psychics that he brought, like Ethel Myers and Ingrid Beckman and others, Nancy Abel, all these people came in the 70s. And Betty Hill joined us because of that, actually, to get a reading by Ethel Myers. And I'm still looking for that tape. So I talked to Hans Holz's daughter, Alexander, and she's going to kind of look around and see if she can find that. I think a lot of people interested in UFOs would be interested to hear what she had to say about Betty. You know, it was Ethel Myers, the famous psychic back then, doing a reading for her at our place.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dennis, for coming on the show this evening. And do keep in touch. If you have anything big going on, let me know. This is Margie Kay, and we will see you here again next week.